got the recording going, so hopefully it works. So hello everyone, we have a guest with us for interview. This is Dr. Jeremiah Peterson, who is a Sumerologist. We have Oliver as well. Hopefully Oliver will not talk through the entire thing. But we're going to ask Dr. Peterson about his work and about a pretty exciting hobby he has, which I think is really cool. So Jeremiah, could you just tell us a bit about yourself and about your research interests?
Hi, I'm Jeremiah Peterson. I have a PhD in Assyriology with a focus on Sumerian from the University of Pennsylvania. I wrote my dissertation about basically Sumerian faunal conception, the systems of taxonomy that they used and the way they thought of animals. And I focused in particular on the conception of the turtle. There's several different texts that give us a pretty clear picture of the way that animal was conceived. But once I got done with that, I felt like doing something else, and I spent a lot of time working with manuscripts in the collection, going through drawers, looking at fragments, making joins, and I just basically, my research after that focused a lot on reconstructing as much text as possible that had not yet seen publication, and I tried to do the best I could with it. That took me in a lot of different directions. I worked a lot on cultic songs, a lot of incantations, lexical lists, and what have you. But throughout my studies, I was always just really interested in the physical act of writing and the physical act of making manuscripts, particularly given how small and meticulous the writing is and how detailed they're obvious works of art, and they have really an intense amount of spatial planning that went into them. And there's a passage from Sumerian text called the Two Scribes, where it basically consists of two scribes trashing each other's ability, and it gets cruder and cruder until it just devolves into a series of insults against each other. But in the middle of it, one of the scribes basically says, you really don't know how to make a manuscript. You don't know how to keep track of the number of lines. You run out of space. You write too quickly. You write too hard with your hand. Your handwriting isn't good. And stuff like that really stuck with me. And I started doing a little bit of experimentation with handwriting and with making manuscripts. And it suddenly occurred to me that it might be kind of fun to turn it into a little small business. And what I did from that point on is I tried to pick texts that were interesting and resonated with a modern audience. There's just so much information that's utterly obscure to most people in modern society that resonates quite well. One particular type of text that really does that is the Proverbs. A lot of Sumerian Proverbs, if you know anything about Proverbs, make absolutely no sense.
Yep, I've gone through a couple and thought, I don't know what this means.
Some of them really just sound like basic insights into the human condition that haven't changed for thousands and thousands of years. So I've made a lot of those. I've made most of the texts I make they try to emulate ancient originals as best I can. Also made some jewelry, but I have a great deal of fun with that.
Have you made an amulet, Jeremiah? Have you made an amulet with Era and Isham, the lines from Era and Isham?
No, I haven't.
I will buy that if you make it.
Okay. I'll have a look through the text sometime.
I actually sat down a couple of days. So Jeremiah has an Etsy shop that I think I found. Eleanor Robeson tweeted about it, and I clicked the link and I thought, oh, this is really, really cool. And you've got a prism there with the whole of Shulgi A on. How long did that take you?
2-3 days.
It's beautiful.
We'll put a link to it
Yeah, we will.
in the description, and it's just
It's a stunning piece of
it
work.
really is.
It took me a long time to figure out how to make that particular piece, and my wife helped me a lot with it because she has a lot more common sense than I do. But basically, what I did is I made a brick mold out of wood, but you can't have it so that it stays because you have to push it out. So I made 4 sides and I used clamps, and then I just pulled them out once I got the clay formed. And then the thing weighs probably, I don't know, 10 pounds.
Wow.
So you have to be very careful with the saturation level of the clay before you can turn it. And I used, which I'm pretty sure they didn't have in antiquity, bubble wrap. They seem to have used felt or as a work surface.
Yeah.
It appears in one of those Eduba compositions, the Sumerian compositions, that some of them tell you a little bit about how the scribal school was run. But I tend to use either drywall, or if the weight is an issue, I use bubble wrap.
Very cool. For people who don't know, one of the challenges with working with cuneiform, especially tablets, is they're almost never found, well, almost never. They're very regularly found incomplete and broken up because they're used in like building foundations. You find them in rubbish pits. They occasionally get broken as like an act of warfare. So museums
and shipment.
And sorry, what?
Shipping to the museum.
Oh, yeah, I hadn't thought of that. So shipments. Museums have a lot of small fragments that may or may not have like the rest of the tablet in the same collection. So it seems like a real labor of love to sit down and sort through these tiny pieces and try and make joins and try and find the bigger text. Was that? It sounds like a massive jigsaw puzzle.
Oh yeah, massive jigsaw puzzle that you never know if the jigsaw puzzle is complete.
Yeah, or even if you have all of the pieces.
Right.
Wow, that's an impressive thing to do. I'm not sure I'd have the patience for that.
Oh, you never know. It's just a matter of just looking at it, committing it to your memory. Sometimes you think you know what that fragment is, and then you join it, or what that fragment is saying, and then you join it, and you realize it wasn't even close. But you have to go through that process to figure out maybe going on. I've always enjoyed working with fragments because, it's really fun to put together puzzles. Basically, just to give more background, if you break clay, it really is a perfect fit if you do manage to figure out that they belong together. So they
join really, really cleanly. There's
right.
none of this, there's a bit missing, it might have joined, but now it doesn't. And...
So, I've made joins in the past where I didn't know what the text said at all. It was just a period, and I just didn't understand what the text said at all, but I went to another drawer and I realized, wait a minute, it's the same tablet, and then boom.
That's fantastic.
Someone who knows about that particular type of text can come upon it later. Maybe know what it is. Advance it a little bit.
Very nice. So how exactly did you get into Sumerology in the ancient world?
Well, I went to Purdue University in the mid-90s, and I studied under a professor, his name is Gordon Young, and he was just really a great guy. He just liked to drink coffee, smoke cigarettes, and talk about the ancient world. And he knew a little bit about everything. He knew a lot about ancient Greece and Rome, and ancient Israel, and he knew a lot about Egypt and Mesopotamia. Mesopotamia was a specialty. So he just wanted to find students that wanted to read ancient texts. I read some cuneiform with him. I actually read more Egyptian.
Oh, wow.
As an undergrad.
That's fascinating. I had a similar experience. I think I did an undergraduate degree in just ancient history. I wanted to be a classicist when I went to college, and by chance, the undergraduate dissertation I wrote was a comparison of Near Eastern and classical mythology. And the classics professor was kind of reserved for students who were purely doing classics. So I ended up with an advisor, Alistair Livingstone, who was a Mesopotamian specialist. And he was just so enthusiastic and passionate about what he did. And I like your advisor, like Dr. Young, he liked to sit and drink tea and talk with his students about the ancient world. And he used to tell us about Swahili grammar, which was a bit of a non sequitur, but I think he grew up for some time in South Africa. But it was just so fascinating. And the thing that really got me, he told me, I must have been like 19 or 20, he told me that one of the fantastic things about the ancient Near East is that there's so much out there that has yet to be discovered. With Greece and Rome, there's so much material already there, already translated, already in the museums. And with the Near East, there's more stuff being unearthed all the time, and it's a very exciting field to work in. And I think that's definitely, for me at least, that's definitely held true. There's just so much happening. It's fantastic stuff. So
yeah,
always
something on the corner.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly. So we've kind of covered your main research interests. Can you talk to me a bit more about the turtle?
You mean my dissertation research?
Yeah.
Well, basically, I went through and analyzed every single piece of textual and, to a lesser extent, pictorial evidence I could find about the turtle. Mm-hmm. And my basic idea was to just simply unearth as much of the conception that was uniquely, loaded term, Sumerian or Mesopotamian, indigenous conception of what the animal was. Mm-hmm. And I read quite a bit about folk taxonomy through what modern anthropologists have done with it. Mm-hmm. And there were some interesting differences, or similarities and differences, to be observed. Two of the more interesting texts that I edited when I did that work, there's a really interesting incantation that's now in Berlin, where basically it's for the ritual use of either the turtle shell or possibly turtle meat in a banquet involving the king. But what it basically consists of is it describes where the turtle came from, what makes it pure and ritually potent.
Oh, wow.
And it has a little creation story in it where probably the sky god ejaculates into the ocean and creates the turtle.
That's fantastic. I actually didn't know that the turtle had a significant place in Mesopotamian cultic activity.
It may or may not have. It's very. It's just that for the Old Babylonian period, it's pretty much that text. Mm-hmm. You get later references to it. So yeah, it just a little snippet that it was actually published originally by David Owen in the 80s.
Okay.
I believe the 70s. I think the 70s.
Interesting. So would you talk a little bit more about what it's like to work with the tablets in the museum? I just because for personal interest, I've never done it. I've not done any museum work, and it always looks very interesting. But I don't know if it's one of those things that it looks very exciting, but actually a lot of it is sitting down and doing data entry.
Well, I think one way to get into that kind of work is you're reading a text and you're at the collection that has the tablet. Mm. One of the sources, and you just go from there. I mean, that's the first tablet I ever read. I think was Gilgamesh and Aga.
Oh, lovely!
And we were reading it in class, and there were a lot of exemplars of the text there. And I went, and I remember specifically, I looked at the first line, the transliteration of it, which is a kind of an abstract and removed phenomenon, and I looked at the real one, and just there it was. Mm. signs were clearly formed, and it made sense, and that was really cool, and I just kept doing it.
That's awesome. I was actually in the Walters Museum yesterday, and something that has always been at the back of my mind is when you work with a text in a hand copy, even in a photograph, it's very, very difficult for me, at least, to maintain some kind of understanding of the scale of these objects. And one of the things they have there is one of the old Assyrian letters, which was maybe that big. It was tiny.
Yeah, tiny.
And it was a lot, I mean, I knew they were small, but it was a lot smaller than I'd actually really understood. And just thinking about how difficult it must have been, well, difficult for me, I assume by the time that you've been doing it for a while, it's less challenging, but to get that level of detail on such a small object, it must take some practice.
It requires a bit of manual dexterity. I think the normal progression, and I've done this a bit myself because I made these objects, is you start pretty big, and when you get more and more manual dexterity, you have a better sense of where everything goes. You can slowly get smaller. But when you write small, you have to write slower, generally, because you have a lot less wiggle room. Things have to be in an exact place. I think one major reason why tablets are so small, it seems like the common sense explanation for it is storage.
Yeah.
If you're keeping any of these, a cuneiform tablet versus say, a piece of paper, it adds up quickly. And we know that ancient Mesopotamians generally didn't live in large houses, so they were always trying to make these things a little bit smaller.
Especially if you're running a business and you have an archive to keep. You don't want to be carting around tablets this big when you can make them tiny. So have you had any archaeological experience?
I have never been on a dig, unfortunately. I wish I had.
Yeah. No, it's tricky. I've not dug. I went and I did a season doing surface collection at Tal Taina, which for the uninitiated is where you walk around a cotton field with your face this far from the ground, picking up anything that looks like it might be ancient pottery. You get really, really good really quickly at recognizing what's actually pottery and what's just a bit of interesting looking mud. And that was fascinating. I really enjoyed that. I didn't make it back for actual digging. I'm actually not sure they're digging there at the moment anyway. But no, it was a great experience. And so Josh wrote a question down here. I'm going to, once I've asked you this, going to go and relieve him from childcare because I know he wanted to talk to you about lamentation texts. But
I'm sure he knows a lot more about them.
How do you go about making your research relatable to people? Because I know this was something that we spoke very briefly about in the email.
Sorry.
In terms of the tablets I make now. Well, basically, I've combed through a lot of the technical corpus, if you will, and just looked for anything that, is a member of modern society. Would this be interesting? Does this relate to some of the basics of the human condition? And I also, if something is just really, really exotic and fascinating, like, for an example, like the Gilgamesh tales, and like at the beginning of the Lugalbanda epic, where they describe the nest of the mythical Anzu bird that is at the very top of the mountain. The animal is terrifying. The animal's in the countryside, that kind of thing. A really vivid textual depiction of something. And another example, like the storm demon that the great gods summoned to destroy the city of Uruk in the Uruk lament. It's just a kind of, at least to our understanding, bizarre and terrible animal or creature that is summoned to do the gods' bidding.
I
that kind of stuff.
You might want to ask about laments and liturgies.
Yeah, I was just kind of looking through some of your publications, and I saw that there was a liturgical lament that you published. I can't remember what it was now. But oh no, it was His Word is a Whale? Or yeah, I can't remember. Was it His Word is a Whale?
Oh yeah. I can't remember. Ilu?
Inimani Ilu.
Okay. Yeah.
So of course I wrote my dissertation on the liturgical laments that were found at Kish, and I don't know. It's not something that I find an awful lot of people working on, and so anytime I run into somebody that's doing it, Cohen, of course, did a lot of work on them. Conrad Folkat in Tübingen did some work, but I always like to talk to people to see. Of course, Dr. Del Nero, my advisor, did an awful lot of work on the laments. But there's fascinating text to me, and particularly given the context in which they were used. Ori Gabay just wrote that 2-volume work on the Erech Shema in 2014, where he talks about the different contexts in which they're used. And I just, nothing specific, but I just thought, maybe we could talk for a couple minutes about it, because,
sure.
Thinking about our audience, and I gave an interview on a show called the Non Sequitur Show, and that seemed to be something that was really interesting to the people watching. And so, of course, you've worked an awful lot in mainstream Sumerian literature, and how do you feel when you read through then the laments? How do they differ? Of course, they're not like Erech Shema's, which are more narrative. The laments are very, of course, they're very formulaic, but there's not a set plot, and I don't know. How does it strike you when you read them, and how do they differ, in your opinion? And give me some insight, maybe, on how they differ from mainstream Sumerian literary texts. And sorry, you don't have to answer that question. That was sort of a lame question. I'm going to let you talk, Jeremiah.
I guess the real transitional text, if you're thinking about this topic, would be the city laments, which are similar in some ways to the Balang, but or the liturgical text, but they're not. They're more focused on a specific point in history. So it's interesting because the Balang liturgical text lasted until basically the very end of the cuneiform era, almost up until the time of Jesus Christ. They serve a very different function. And I have to be honest, I'm trying to remember exactly. They're recited during certain rituals.
So instructions.
They're often recited to pacify the potential anger of a god. If you're doing something in a temple, like changing the walls, or I guess even moving the god. But again, my expertise is a little lacking on this. I know that the Erech Shahunga, the Erech Shemas do this too. So there's a very long formulaic use, and we have a much better sense of the ritual use of these particular texts than we do for most Sumerian literature, which we're only guessing on in most instances. There are cultic songs of various types that are usually written in the non-Emisal, the standard dialect, and we don't know exactly when those are used. But this basically, the liturgical texts they're kind of their own thing. I've done a little bit with them. I did quite a lot with the Seleucid era Uruk texts. I was working for University of Pennsylvania at the time. I went through a lot of those. Have I answered your question?
Oh yeah, definitely. Sorry, there wasn't anything specific. It's you're clearly, at the top of your game in Sumerian, and it's just nice to talk to somebody that's worked in these texts, that's worked in the literary text as well, to just sort of get a feel for what you thought about them when you were working with them. And so let me ask.
Go ahead. I'm sorry.
No, go ahead.
I was just there, as you pointed out before. There are very few people that are immersed in the Balang liturgical texts. They are their own thing. People tend to think that it can be learned relatively quickly, but that's not true at all. And there are actually some Balang texts that have a significant myth in them. Mm-hmm. Kramer published quite a few of these. A lot of them are in the British Museum. Mm-hmm. It's just kind of a different subset. And yeah, I mean, unless you're really into that particular subset, it's very easy to not have a particular amount of expertise in it,
and to see them as kind of boring given their repetitive nature. I mean, I remember, when I would tell people that I was working on those, they kind of roll their eyes and say, "Oh, well, they're so boring." The thing is, I didn't find them terribly boring. I suspect a lot of it had to do with the fact that the texts from Kish are written in that syllabic, phonetic. I mean, not syllabic, the phonetic system, the orthographic system. But I don't know. Anytime you have, like you said, significant information, substantial information into how that particular text was actually used ritually, how can that not be exciting?
It's fascinating.
Yeah.
Because just to draw an analogy, in the first millennium, we know a lot about the way major rituals worked because they put them up in a huge serialized text. But in the Old Babylonian period, which is where I do most of my research, you pretty much have the incantations they used to ensure the purity of whatever they were using in the ritual. You don't have that overall look what exactly was going on. Now we can speculate a bit about that kind of stuff, but it's not really there. And anything that does have a hinge is just particularly fascinating.
Indeed. Well, I don't know what you guys have talked about because I was keeping Oliver somewhat contained. But I wanted to ask, so we're getting ready to start. We're getting ready to launch an introduction to Sumerian grammar video series on the site or on the channel. And I just put a video together that was called Why Bother to Learn Sumerian? And I'm sure that you've been asked that question before. Why on earth did you learn Sumerian?
Why are you doing this with your life?
But, I mean, I want to get your opinion, or maybe even if you were talking to a group of people that were considering getting into Sumerian and Akkadian and trying to learn the languages themselves, to be able to work with the text themselves. What I come up against when I talk to people about this sort of thing is they view it as a very ivory tower endeavor, and it's going to take 3 decades before I can do anything at all, from a translation standpoint or to work with the text, because they see people that learn Greek and Hebrew and how difficult that is, and Sumerian is, so much further up there on the scale of difficulty. But what would you say to that group of people that thinking about doing it and want to? Would you say that it's something that's achievable? Would you say that there are maybe varying levels of proficiency? Could you maybe speak to that a little bit from an encouragement standpoint, maybe?
Well, I think it really isn't as hard as you think it is, would be my overarching statement. If you're a very visual learner in terms of Sumerian, because I am a very visual learner. If you're good at memorizing shapes and signs and stringing them together, keeping them up there and maybe retrieving them a little bit later, it really speaks to that kind of thinker. Because every sign in Sumerian has a self-contained meaning, whereas we've talked a little bit about syllabic writing. If you write it syllabically, you have to kind of abstract yourself a little bit from the material and look at it and get what you're getting at a kind of a slightly later point. Does that make any sense? Mm-hmm. But there's a certain directness about Sumerian that if cuneiform signs come naturally to you, then you can do quite a bit with it quite quickly. And of course, the other thing about Sumerian is there's a lot of inconsistencies, and interpretations can be quite difficult. There's just simple details like the first and second person are pretty much exactly the same, which just always throws me for a loop. Yep. But you get used to it. You kind of progress through what can this be, and you make a reasonable decision. And if you're wrong, you go back and correct it. I would just say it's not as hard as like anything else. If you do it for a while, it really does start to make sense. There really was a group of people thousands of years ago that used it effectively. It may be the case that it was used. I mean, many scholars think that it was used retroactively, and that the appreciation of the grammar and even the lexicon kind of degraded by the time we get text, our biggest volume of texts. But they understood it well enough to produce it as a functional language.
Well, we're getting ready to have a debate or a discussion, not a debate, I don't suppose, a discussion about Zecharia Sitchin.
Yes.
Excited, are you?
Yes.
I've been working my way through the 12th planet, and I'm about 3/4 of the way through, and I am ready to either shoot myself or burn the book.
Hopefully it's the latter, not the former.
Right. But, so something like that, where he's basing so many of his conclusions on the Sumerian texts, ancient Mesopotamian culture, that sort of thing. If you don't have an in with that in that field, it's kind of tough to, kind of work through his arguments and figure out.
And work out that he's talking dribble.
Yes.
Because if you don't know Sumerian, if you don't know Mesopotamian iconography or anything about cylinder seals and the artwork used on it, some of the conclusions he draws are quite logical seeming.
Yeah.
Which is honestly a little scary.
Yeah. But I wanted to say, so, that sort of thing maybe jumps out at people, like what could you use a knowledge and understanding of Sumerian for, if something like that, working with Zecharia Sitchin stuff. But on a more general level, I mean, in your experience, if someone were thinking about learning Sumerian or reading, just not even learning the language, but just reading through the literary text, the mythological text, or even the administrative, economic, legal stuff, what benefit would it have, would you think? What would you say would be a benefit to them in relating to other aspects of the ancient Near East? Of course, I always make the connection back to the Bible, but I mean, broadly, what would you say, in your experience, are the benefits of really learning about Mesopotamian culture?
Well, honestly, I think the more you know about a specific culture and a specific textual tradition, you just realize that they're all very unique. They all have remarkable insights that are well worth knowing, well worth sharing. And, we only have so much we can fit into our heads, of course. But if you go on and do something else with another culture, you can kind of compare and contrast, and it becomes extremely interesting, just from that standpoint. I know I've studied in less detail Greece, Rome, Egypt, Israel. earlier on in my academic career. And you know, I don't know if I'll ever be able to get back to those civilizations to study them in detail, but you know, you kind of reach a point where you can never think the way they did. That's really presumptuous, but you can kind of see the background that prompts certain things to be in certain places, and that becomes really interesting. And really, it's really good to have research that touches upon that level. I mean, it's good to make connections with other scholars, with other research areas once you've done that. And when you study this stuff enough, it kind of has a way of humbling you. Where you're really not interested in making some grand sweeping statement that you think changes everything. You just want to understand a little bit more.
Yeah. That's great. Well, I have really,
very much.
I've really enjoyed this. It's fantastic. And sorry, I don't want to take over your role there.
No, don't worry.
Megan's in charge of these interviews, you see, amongst other things.
No, thank you so much for coming and talking to us. I really, really appreciate it.
And we're gonna put links, everybody. We're gonna put links to
the Etsy shop, and you should definitely check it out because they're really lovely.
Yeah,
really lovely.
I'm serious about the
Aranisham.
Yeah, the Aranisham amulet. I think that would be really cool. But there's all kinds of other stuff that he's got on there.
There's one about farting.
Yep.
I mean, who doesn't love cuneiform proverbs about farting?
It's a very good seller.
Yeah, I'm sure. But it's really a beautiful work. He's got necklaces, and he's got a tablet that you can put on a stand and set in your study. Or I'm going to be getting one for a friend of mine. They're just they're beautiful pieces. So please go check them out. They're fantastic.
And thank you again, Jeremiah.
Thank you.
Peterson, appreciate it, sir.